All yours, Mary. Okay, welcome everyone. We have continued to have some folks join us, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Mary McCarthy with the T2 Center, and I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon and provide this opportunity for us to learn a little bit more about a rural perspective on Complete Streets and hear from Steve Maslin with the town of Ledyard. Steve is the Director of Public Works for the town of Ledyard, and they've got a really exciting project in the works. So we're going to learn a little bit more about their project and about their experience. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go ahead and get started. Hold on one second, Steve. Okay. Let's see, can everybody see my screen? Hopefully you can. And so yeah, Steve, you're all set. Oh, thank you. Steve, I would love to have you tell us a little bit more about the Ledyard High School multi-use pathway and sidewalk extension.
Okay, so this is a project that kind of is a extension, not just in nature, but of a broader initiative in the center of Ledyard to expand pedestrian access and actually some beautification initiatives. There have been other projects along the street stretch of Route 117 to which the Colonel Ledyard Highway multi-use pathway ties into, that go back to some other grants that we have leveraged in the past. So it's just kind of an extension of existing efforts, expanding efforts to bring better infrastructure and access through that infrastructure to the center of town. And so part of this is being of a posture to seize opportunities as they come along and marry them to grants that are available. The LoSIP grant happened to come along at a time when we had been positioned already in advance to have some preliminary plans for a multi-use pathway in this vicinity. And it turns out that the LoSIP grant of I think it's 2020 that we got involved with, was looking for these type of projects. So we actually got a high priority in the approval process through the local government, the consortium here, the Southeastern Connecticut Council of Governments that Ledyard belongs to. So this is the project area. I don't know if you can see it, but so there's some in yellow there. You can see some key facilities that are being interconnected by virtue of this multi-use pathway. On the far right, you've got Ledyard High School, and I'll stop right there and say that I and a number of officials have been involved in what's called a civics roundtable every year, where we would go speak with the students and get several perspectives from them. And sidewalks always came up, and of course I was always in the hot seat about sidewalks, and in particular this stretch from the high school to the center of town. Colonel Ledyard Highway, and I'll mention it now because it'll be relevant as we go along, from all the way, as you see the arrow going to the center there, that used to be a state road, and further south as well, Route 27. Some years before my time, Ledyard and the state made a swap. The town received Colonel Ledyard Highway, and they received a what is now Route 214 to the north of this stretch, east-west. And so this is one of our busier roads, one of our higher speed roads, but on the positive side, it was built originally to state standards. So we've got wide right-of-ways and the type of infrastructure baseline that we can work with better than like some of the town roads, older town roads that we have. So, and then in the center, you see it's very busy there. We've got, well, there's a Board of Ed facility. So there's the major administrative offices for the Board of Ed. The Parks and Recreation facility that's one of a number of them, but the major Parks and Rec facility is there. Then you get to the center of town and you've got the town hall, the police station, and then commercial, small level of commercial businesses. You've got a major grocery store market. You've got a mom and pop lawn and garden center. that's been there for many years, hardware store. You've got what used to be a elementary school that 3 years ago, I think, was shifted over as they moved the population of the children from there to another upgraded elementary school. That has now been bought out by a commercial developer who has converted it to a storefront, as it were. You've got a town green, which used to be formerly a fairgrounds, that we're investing a lot of money from other grants and other town funds to improve it as an attraction for the town. And it now hosts already for the last 2 years one of the top farmers markets in the state of Connecticut. So all of these, and then there's a library. So, and then there's various smaller commercial attractions along Colonel Ledyard Highway in proximity to the center. So all of these things are, this multi-use pathway will interconnect everything from the high school to the center and also provide a much safer, obviously, pedestrian traffic and bicycling route for that stretch of that road. So I think if that's enough, we can move to the next slide. Okay, just this is being handled under the LoTSIP program. And so there's a description there of the funds. We, as a town, as you may be familiar with the LoTSIP program, fully fund the design, which is almost complete now, and then the state funds construction. This is not a federally funded project. So the coordination of this is with us. I mentioned the Southeastern Connecticut Council of Governments, and then the Connecticut DOT. So those are the three main parties. It would be the town, and then those two parties, for us anyway, in the southeastern corner of the state. And Weston and Sampson, I'll mention, this slide presentation is largely the presentation that Weston and Sampson made for public presentation of this project that's required for LoTSIP. And they did a great job in a number of ways. And so I simply just leveraged their slideshow and trimmed it down here, there, and adjusted it here, there for use. So existing conditions, there's 4 slides here to look at. You might, if you were going from the west side to the east, this kind of shows what we're working with. And you see on the top left corner, there is an existing guide rail that runs north-south along Route 117. So it's in that area there that Mary is highlighting. And that is going to be, we're going to do an improvement there as well in terms of just a pedestrian sidewalk to connect it now to the new new Best Way Citgo convenience store, fuel gas station there. They are required to bring sidewalk to their property boundary, but that's where it ends. So we're going to connect to them and bring them up into the center of town with a legit sidewalk. What you see is some pavement behind guide rail that people use, but it's not really a suitable sidewalk. So then the other 2 slides you see are related to the library. You see on the top center, that's the sidewalk that exists going from north of the library to Route 117. And it will be left intact as a pedestrian sidewalk. We'll run a parallel multi-use pathway sidewalk to connect to the center of town. And then that cul-de-sac intersecting on the bottom left there, that's the Ray Holdridge Circle that you'll see will be modified as well as part of this project. So we can go to the next existing condition. So here, this is where you have a lot of residential property with a couple of mom and pop commercial outlets. You've got and this just shows typically what we are dealing with in terms of the shoulder in those areas with the residential properties. And you can see that it's tight. You'll see where we end up choosing to put this path, but either north or south of the road, you'll see that it's going to be in close proximity to people's front yards. So it's going to be something very new for people there. And we have not had any pushback on this, but I'm sure as it gets to be more known what's going on and see things in action, we will be answering a lot of questions. But there is a restaurant, a little mom and pop restaurant right there. And then down on the south side toward the east is a center drive. There's a little motorcycle shop there. So this will provide interconnectivity for patrons there, especially as they walk from other library, the Board of Ed building, staff there and others from the high school. I mean, it'll help for a lot of at least pedestrian traffic in those areas, but certainly bicycle traffic as well. Okay, we'll go to number 3. This is where we get into some of the challenges for this particular pathway. You see the grades behind the guide rail, and this came into our selection criteria as we'll see further. But as we approach the intersection for the high school at Gallup Hill Road there, on both the north and south side, we had grade issues. There had to be a tremendous amount of fill to achieve the kind of profile they needed for the road in that area. And it's a super elevated stretch of road, as state standards would have dictated. And that comes into the safety issue in terms of speeds coming to and going through that area of the road. So that gives you a pretty good idea of kind of, okay, now we've got to put a 10-foot wide pathway with a buffer to the road edge or to the guide rail behind in those areas. So it's a pretty good challenge here, and we'll see some of the profiles or the sectional views of what's proposed in those areas. So then we come to the next slide, which shows more directly the intersection that takes you to the high school. And you can see it's a Y intersection here. And as you will, I'm sure, know, when you have a Y intersection, especially access and egress to and from the north, people really fly and maybe even run stop signs there. So it became a challenge for locating the crosswalks and just reorienting that intersection to mitigate speeds in that area for pedestrian traffic that would be increasing there. And so you'll see in the design how Weston and Sampson accommodated that as well. Okay, so here's the selection criteria. Weston and Sampson, so the rating are priorities of these criteria. And this was important because of the various options that we had in selecting the location of the pathway. So you can see these: connectivity and access, high, just is naturally going to be probably by definition high for a multi-use pathway. Safety, obviously. And then from there, we had to really pick our way through these to prioritize them. And so you have right of way, available right of way. Again, I mentioned, thankfully, and this isn't going to be the case for all rural roads naturally, because it was a former state road. It wasn't uniform in its width, but it was generous usually in its width. But still, there were areas that were tight we had to consider for right of way. Abutters impact, property impact, of course, naturally, we'd want to consider that at least modestly. Topography, you'll see some of the issues there with us. Wetlands impacts, that's usually by definition something important. Tree impacts, we don't have a huge amount of overstory in that area, a canopy, so it wasn't as much of an important thing. There weren't a lot of these real aesthetic big trees in these areas that presented an issue for us. Utility conflicts, we decided we could work through those. Sanitary sewer opportunities, that will come up here as I get further along in the discussion as something that came along after we got this project started. So it wasn't originally considered as something that we needed to look at. Maintenance, ice and snow, as a public works director, I wasn't going to let them make that a 1. We had to deal with that, but now you add a 10-foot wide multi-use pathway, we have to maintain that. So that is going to require, as I've passed on to town leadership, a new piece of equipment really to deal with this, to take care of it in a timely and a suitable fashion. And then cost order of magnitude, not the highest, but important. Okay. So this is where we ended up. 3 different possible routes that we were looking at that had to be rated. You have a north side, which is strictly along the north side of Colonel Ledyard Highway, all the way to where you would cross ultimately on Gallup Hill Road at the high school. You still have a crossing once you got to the high school there. Then you had the south side route, which is in red, and you would have to cross Colonel Ledyard Highway to use the south side, and then cross back as you got back to the library end. Okay, and then you had a hybrid route which is in blue, where we would cross over initially, come along, and then get about 2/3 of the way down, and then cross back to the north, and then take it from there and not have an additional crossing, but then pick up where the north route would take off. And then there's the yellow at the far left or the west end. Again, you see the vertical stretch of that. That's the interconnectivity of the existing sidewalk to the new sidewalk at the gas station. That's a given. And then we had to pick which side, the north or the south side, depending on which sidewalk we went to. So those were the three options. Okay, this is just to show you the math. The 1 through 3 ratings on the far left by way of the category. Then on the ranking, we determined for the north, south, and the hybrid version, where they ranked in terms of each category, and where that ranking brought you in terms of a individual rating for each pathway, for each category or each selection. And then you would then do the math. So, but you still see, short of the weighted score at the bottom, you still see that the north side was marginally better than the hybrid, but then markedly better than the south route. So, but then when you do the weighting with the different categories, you see it brings separation, certainly marked separation between north and south, but even between the north and the hybrid. So that is how we came to choosing a straight north way configuration. It didn't mean that the north was going to be without its cons. It just meant that on balance, it was the best way to go overall. And I thought it was a very good process and yielded a good result. And in fact, I was glad that Weston and Sampson presented this as approach, because staff, between myself and the planner, we were pushing for a south side approach based on a limited range of factors. And so when they brought this up, it kind of clarified for us that, yeah, well, the north is the way to go. And so here are the different typical sections based on the profiles of the road at certain locations. This is just a standard. Generally, if you had generally level grades in the area, this is what you're looking at in terms of a roadway and then the multi-use pathway with a buffer. And it varies. So it's relatively speaking, the buffer, I think, is going to be narrower along its pathway, just because the state right-of-way, or the town right-of-way now, but what right-of-way was available is not wide enough to really capture a large buffer. So that's the flat condition, which occupies a large section of this pathway. Okay, so then you get a sloped condition, which is just marginally sloped, but you see the super elevated pavement. And so you can still deal with it just by grading, with grading efforts, without any retaining walls or any special other measures. You can still achieve this with grading. And you'll see, I know a question was asked about this, I'll answer it now. And you can see in these sections, we are going with bituminous concrete. And that was chosen both from the standpoint of capital cost and also maintainability in the long run. Okay, and then the final section I think we have here. Now this is where you have a steep slope. And if you remember, in those sections approaching the high school intersection there, this is what we're dealing with. So there will be some substantial cost there to provide a retaining wall that will allow us to have the fill we need to have a solid compacted base beneath the multi-use pathway. I'll just say this, there was some thought, not for long, but there was some thought to using a wooden elevated boardwalk type of a pathway. And so you'd have you'd have pillars upon which this would sit, and that just, we didn't linger with that too long. Yeah, we know it'd be an expensive proposition for the amount of fill we need to put there, but really from a stability standpoint, maintainability standpoint, you really need to have something where it's a solid fill scenario. So this, I won't linger here long because you can't see it. We got slides that will capture, again, the 4 sections of this as we go. You can kind of see in the darker gray what is proposed in the actual infrastructure. But what we'll do is we'll go now slide by slide from west to east, and you'll be able to see this much more clearly. So here we have the chosen north pathway, and you see on the west side of the road, you see the extension of the sidewalk. That's the standard, I think it's a 5-foot width sidewalk to tie it in. Then you see a sidewalk being taken from the cul-de-sac intersection to a proposed crosswalk at the north side of a signalized intersection there at Colonel Ledyard Highway and Route 117. So that's there. And then you see what we've done. We've eliminated the cul-de-sac and redone the parking configuration at the library. There's a church just above the library there, and so we're in a community center attached to the church. So this will serve that complex. But you see how we've just turned it into a road that ends in a modified parking area, and then you see how the new multi-use pathway is brought up, crosses the access that goes to the town green there, and ties in to it eventually ties into the existing sidewalk and overtakes that sidewalk as it comes to Route 117. Now, there is not a 10-foot wide sidewalk at Route 117. It comes back to the standard width. It may be 6-foot wide there, but not certainly 10-foot wide. And then you see the pathway going on the north side of Colonel Ledyard Highway toward the east. Now, I throw this up here just to show this is the design that is proposed for the crosswalk at the state road. It's a signalized intersection. It turns out that the state is upgrading their signals at this particular intersection. So we have been coordinating with them in this. And this is important because you have to get in as early as possible with their process to make this work. And it got a little bit out of whack here because we changed our mind. Unfortunately, it's not a state problem. It was our problem, as it turns out, that we originally were thinking south. When they wanted an answer as soon as we could get it to them, we were looking at a southern crossing. So Mary, go to the next slide, and you'll see this is what the state had proposed. It's a little busier, but the crosswalk, it's oriented differently too, but the crosswalk is on what is effectively the south side right there. That was the last official drawing that was put out. So it's out of sync. It was out of sync with our ultimate final decision to go with the north side pathway. And we're still working with the state to sort that out. But I guess the lesson there is, especially with their needs and their administrative process, nail it down as solidly as possible, as soon as possible. And it's just coincidental that they were looking at doing this at this time when we were looking at a multi-use pathway. So hopefully, I'm sure we'll figure out a way to make this work out. So then we'll go we're going now a little bit further. We're going easterly now, and there's nothing, this is just a basic, standard stretch of pathway without any major topographical issues. There might be some slight grading issues at certain yards here that have some slope issues to deal with, but nothing major. And this is where we have the restaurant, and we have on the north side. So they're going to benefit from, of course, having a sidewalk, a multi-use pathway of this nature to convey traffic, pedestrian and otherwise, to their location. And then on the south side, we'll probably put a sidewalk, a crosswalk to the motorcycle shop there to deal with their traffic. And this is where we come into the major grading issues. that we have to deal with here on the north side. We've got some houses that, and I should have pointed it out in more detail, but right there, those two houses, there are some severe slope driveways there, and very, of course, to deal with that transition in such a narrow way as space in the right of way, to flatten it out and then get back to their driveway is going to be a challenge. But that was one of the trade-offs here to deal with, and so that's a challenge there. And then as we move to the further, now we can go to the next slide, and this brings the intersection more into view. You can see the realignment of the intersection, and it's I guess you call it a traffic calming approach here, especially with traffic coming to and from the north. Again, we shorten the throat of it so that the crosswalk is shorter, so you're not exposing pedestrian and bicycle traffic at the original length of the intersection, and you are forcing traffic to come to a stop as they enter Colonel Ledyard Highway and slow considerably as they're turning left onto Gallop Hill Road as they approach that crosswalk. And then you see the multi-use pathway coming in from the high school there, and we're going to clear the sight line considerably to the south so that on the outside of the curve there'll be a considerable view, both of those entering the crosswalk and traffic coming from the south. And then it just nicely takes you right to the high school, where there are existing driveways, and then it'll bring I'm sure we'll put bicycle racks and stuff there for the kids to leave it there. I mean, I think this will open up avenues for many at this certain stage of high school where they live in the vicinity to take their bikes to school or otherwise. And along the, let me just say, along the pathway, and I don't have answers to all of these questions yet. I haven't seen the final designs, but there will be different, they'll be putting benches down. We're looking at like local lighting things that we might consider, and signage of different nature, to maybe even historical informational signs. And of course, the normal needed traffic and safety signs will be included in all of this too. So there's still a lot of fine tuning to be done here, but a lot of creativity has already been brought into this situation, and a lot of knowledge from the consultant to know, we're not pioneers in a lot of ways on this. There's a lot of things that they already know that people like to have, and we're looking forward to adding those embellishments, I guess you would call them. Oh, one final thing, sorry. I mentioned the sewer situation. Obviously, we as towns are all dealing with a lot of infrastructure money being thrown at us from different directions. And so it is bringing to bear a lot more opportunities coincidentally than might have originally been considered. Ledyard is not a highly sewered town. In fact, we only have one sewer plant, but it does happen to serve the high school. And we don't have sewers in the center of town, but if we could extend the line that goes to the high school and the infrastructure that serves that, take a pressure line all the way to the center of town, then we have a whole nother range of options, as we all know, in terms of economic development, and then other opportunities for existing facilities that are already there. Well, it turns out that the town said we're going to throw some of the ARPA money at that sewer line. And well, where would you put a sewer line going from the high school to the center? Naturally under the multi-use pathway. So we have been delayed, it looks like about a year, in order to synchronize all of this. So that is still in motion. This will be bid out, and we're planning anyway to bid it out as a integrated contract for all that work. It only makes sense to do that, I would suppose, for efficiencies and communications and all that. So we would have been probably looking at bidding already by now, but we'll probably be a year out or so, later this year. So construction of next year for this whole package. Okay. Hi, Kate.
Hi. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm going to stop my share for the time, and then if we need to open it back up to come back to a certain slide, we can. Okay. So yeah, I think it just, when I heard about this project, I was talking with Kate from Southeast Cog, and just trying to get a good rural perspective, and a project that a lot of towns in Connecticut may be interested in pursuing, especially more rural towns, and how to make those connections in a rural area. And so I really appreciate Steve agreeing to present this project. We do have a couple of questions that came through in the registration. Some of them you answered, Steve, regarding the materials that are being used for the trail. I know you're going with bituminous. Have you had any thoughts about the retaining wall treatments, or have you gotten that far with things?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I think you're gonna have to get out there and take a look,
Oh, yeah.
figure out what you need. And you mentioned installing some signage. Will you be focusing primarily, at least at first, on the advisory signage and those where you are connecting or crossing roadways, and kind of approaching some of that?
Yeah.
And I think it'll be really interesting, and I think it'll be an added feature if you can get some of that wayfinding and some of the historical, information out there for folks. Some good opportunities to partner with your historical society or Chamber of Commerce, or things like that. I think your point about working and trying to coordinate things with the state, I think that is a message that we've heard, and this is our sixth spotlight in the series, and our final one for now. And almost to a presentation, it makes sense to be efficient and to have some plans in place, so that even if they're just rough ideas, right? I mean, Steve, you talked about that, to have kind of a wish list and some ideas on what you want to do, and something put together, so that as your COG and your region or the state are making plans or have funding become available, that you can take advantage of that. So I think that's a really good message to share. Does anybody have any questions for Steve or for Kate? Kate Rattan is with us today from Southeast COG. And Kate, I don't know if you have any comments or points that you'd like to make about this project, or about what you're seeing come through in the southeast part of the state.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to say what a great project this is, and it is a big undertaking to try and mesh those two projects together in terms of project delivery. So that'll be a new experience for me. I haven't done that in a LOTSIP project yet. I don't know, Steve, if you could speak to like some of you guys have gotten your commitment to fund for this project through the LOTSIP program, and it was previously scoped for other funding. So can you talk a little bit about the differences in trying to shoehorn this project into LOTSIP, and what additional things DOT was looking for when applying for the state funds through LOTSIP?
Well, thankfully, with the small staff we have here, relying on our consultants, they handle a lot of those things, and we've not had to deal with a lot of it directly as staff. So I guess it depends on whose lap that falls in, and I don't particularly remember any major issues that have come along, although I'm sure there was a lot of detailed review and activity going on at the points in which that was essential. And we just did get our commitment to fund. So this has been in motion a while. I'm not sure if it was a timely thing and all that, but it didn't turn out to be an issue because of the other project coming along. And like you, Kate, I think it's going to be a challenge. I just talked to the mayor today, and that kind of came along in a way that it was kind of out there as a little orphan that was making its own pathway, no pun intended. But the idea is it's got to be integrated now under one staff member to kind of coordinate, and guess who that's going to be, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I guess I just also wanted to note that under the LOTSIP program, this one is kind of interesting because from the standpoint at the COG, the drainage improvements along the roadway were kind of a bonus, and something to keep in mind in a rural, if you are outside of the urban area boundary, only major collectors and arterials are eligible for the program, and what that means is that you can fund a sidewalk, and you can fund incidental drainage requirements that were created by the installation of the sidewalk, but any additional drainage improvement that wasn't caused by the sidewalk itself is not eligible. So it's a lot of like little programming minutia that I wasn't that was a learning experience for me. So I think that is really important to take into consideration. So for example, like if you're doing a sidewalk project in a rural area, that's great. You can make pedestrian scale lighting. Can you make roadway lighting? They might, DOT might look at that a little differently. And that's the same when it would come to like the size of your drainage RPC, whether that's sufficient, if it was insufficient because you added the sidewalk versus because it's insufficient already. That's where the rubber hits the road.
I think that's a really good example, though, Kate, of how smaller towns with less staff really rely on the regional folks and the COG staff to help navigate. And of course, with you all kind of coordinating all of the LOTSIP projects and kind of getting those through the system. When you have a small town and you're relying on consulting engineers and, pretty much anybody that it takes a village, I guess, right? to get these projects built in smaller towns. But it's just so important to have that coordination and to have that communication happening so that you can take advantage of things as they come and you can address things as early as possible so that everybody can get on the same page. Good comment here from Dimitri. The 2-in-1. I think that's wonderful that you're being able to coordinate that. It will be a lot of work, but a question that he did have though is, will that signalized intersection have bicycle signals since you're incorporating or including bikes and with the path is kind of going to draw them? So
I don't think the bicycle portion of the multi-use pathway is carried all the way to the signalized intersection.
Right, you swap over to the sidewalk there.
So there will not be, I don't believe, any bicycle signalization there.
I can add a little bit to that. So DOT is moving from the loop detectors to video detection, and the video detectors are better at detecting bicyclists. So if they are within the view shed of the video detector, they should be tripping the light. But as towns, it is your responsibility to tell DOT when they say that they have a signal project that cyclists occur in this location, and the video detection needs to be adjusted so that it will detect those bicyclists.
Sure. Great. Anybody have any other questions for Steve or Kate? You can,
Yeah,
feel
I'm
free.
John
Yes,
Cabibbo from Town of Enfield. I did have a question about the residents that are getting a new path in front of their house. Have you had any feedback from them? The town, Enfield is done. We have one rural section of multi-use path. We're in the process of designing an extension of that one. And we also have another section that's less rural, and we're about to meet with those residents coming up soon. And that one's actually on a state highway, but I was just curious because it does look, Steve mentioned it, some of those houses are fairly close. And you put a 10-foot path in front of their house. Just was
Okay.
interested.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's the first thing that came to mind when I looked at what this was going to present to these individuals. And I was pleasantly surprised anecdotally when I was in the field as surveying was being done, that people, even the ones that were the closest, were like, oh, they should have done this a long time ago. Now, that's not everyone, but it was at least what we've heard is encouraging. Another thing that I told the mayor and the council is that we have an ordinance that imposes the maintenance liability on adjacent homeowners. I said, you can't do that to them for this pathway. This is going to have to be something that the town absorbs. And so they had buy-in there, and that's the way it was presented, because we just couldn't impose that. It wouldn't be fair. And not only that, but you wouldn't have a clear, pathway in a timely fashion. So they understand that. So I still anticipate that once the reality of this hits and they see what it looks like in front of them, we're going to get some maybe more negative feedback, but we haven't received anything yet. Not too many people came out to the public hearing. And, I thought the town made a reasonable effort in notifying people. So I don't know. Well, I guess it's partially so far so good, but an open question.
Yeah, the rural one that we have, the town does clear snow.
Yeah.
And I imagine they will on the other, there really weren't many abutters. There might be 3 or 4 in total. This other section we're talking about is the houses look more like your project, a little closer together. And we did have an initial meeting with them, and well, usually the more vocal people are less positive. So, put it that way. But yeah, that's a question too, as far as the snow removal. We have done it on the rural part of it, and most of that's because there's only 3 or 4 resident, properties out there on it anyway, where there are houses. So, but we do have equipment to do that.
Right.
It does end up being, it's more work to do for public works for sure.
It is.
Yeah,
I
I think
appreciate it. The project looks, it's a nice looking project, and I appreciate you doing this. It's good information.
All right, John, thanks.
this project is a great plug for creating facilities that are maintainable. Thankfully, DPW was involved from the get-go, but if you can plow it with a truck as opposed to having to get out there with a snowblower, I think that it makes it infinitely more maintainable. So obviously, it's not going to be in the first wave of plowing, but it's at least manageable for the long term. And the other thing is you also want to look at access to the area behind your retaining walls. Here we have significant right of way behind that retaining wall, but I see some of designs coming in where the retaining wall is right up to the property line, which can make it difficult to maintain and make sure that facility stays maintained for the longer term.
Right.
A question from Jason about the 10-foot width. Is that why you chose the width, was for ease of plowing or maintenance, or?
No, I think that was more of a standard value. I'm not sure if it's the minimum value to achieve a multi-use. I don't know, Kate, if you know that. It might be the minimum value to achieve a multi-use function. And we had to go with the minimum because we are right up against the right of way in a couple spots. So for a uniform width 10-foot was the minimum. And, you know, whether we plow it with a pickup or whether we get special equipment that we can use in other places has still an open question. You know, I believe me, in a public works department, you get all kinds of suggestions.
Yeah, you would have to follow the ProWAG guidance, which is kind of the ADA accessibility guide for public rights of way. And that would require 10-foot minimum unless you were on there's an exception for, like, if you're on a bridge and, you know, the alternative is to completely reconstruct the bridge, they let you get away with your 8-foot sidewalk instead, but it is really limited.
Gotcha. All right, thank you. Any other questions? You can either put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself or share your video, whichever works. I think we took care of everything in the chat. Well, I want to thank you, Steve, so much for your time. I really appreciate you sharing this project with us. And I'm really looking forward to kind of following along and seeing how it develops. And hopefully we'll be able to reconnect sometime in the future and get an update.
Well, hopefully they'll get it done before I retire.
Hang in there, buddy. Hang in there. All right. Well, just a couple of comments. This is our final spotlight presentation for the current series, but we're always interested in sharing these good stories. So if you have a good story to share, a project that you found to be creative, or maybe not one that you did yourself, but one that you've heard about that you'd like to learn more about, please reach out. You can reach me at mary.c.mccarthy@uconn.edu. And I'm always looking for those stories. And also, as we mentioned, this is being recorded as part of the project, and we have a web page devoted to Complete Streets Information Exchange. And all 6 of the videos of the presentations are there, along with copies of the presentations themselves, the slide deck, and any resources that might have been shared as far as detailed sheets or maps or things like that. So please be sure to check out that website. And, you know, if you got time on your hands over lunch and you're looking for something riveting, you can take a look and watch one of the recordings and learn about what your colleagues are up to around the state. So thank you all for your time. Thank you, Steve, for yours. And stay safe out there. And thank you for your participation. Have a good afternoon.